Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rich, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rach. Hey, Rach.
Hey, Rich. And we're also joined today by Paul Beakley of the Indie Game Reading Club blog. Hey, Paul, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rach. How are you?
Hey.
Hi, Rich.
Hey.
Hey, Paul, tell us a little bit about your history of Powered by the Apocalypse. How did you get started?
Sure. Well, my first game was Apocalypse World First Edition.
Nice.
Before that, it was Poisoned, which I will argue is pretty much the original PBTA game. And played lots ever since then.
Was your first foray into Apocalypse World playing or MCing?
MCing and really screwing it up, and then talking to Vincent about it at a convention, and then screwing it up some more, and maybe 3 or 4 tries in, it kind of clicked over and saw what I was doing wrong and got it figured out.
So the fail forward class of MCing.
A lot of failing forward.
Now back then it wasn't XP on a fail either. It just,
Yeah.
What stat did you have highlighted?
Oh, probably weird.
All right, well, let's jump on over here and read a sitch. Read a sitch. So in Read a Sitch, we talk about specific issue of play, a journal of play, observing things happening in an ongoing PBTA game. We have a twofold purpose for our Read a Sitch for this episode. First, in case you thought we forgot about you, Rich Howard. Many months ago, Rich Howard, the creator of A Descent into Midnight, he asked us, have you done an episode on fronts or clocks? I don't see one specifically by those names, and I'd love your insight. I could really use a primer on how those work from the perspective of different games. So we're going to try to answer that, and the reason we have Paul on is he recently wrote a blog on the Indie Game Reading Club called Prep 2.0. During that, you share some of your thoughts on clocks. Now, of course, the Indie Game Reading Club is not a PBTA-specific blog, but Prep 2.0 is definitely part of fronts and clocks and all that good stuff. So we're going to mix all that together and try to bake up a really sweet-tasting cake today. So, Paul, tell us a little bit about your goal with writing the Prep 2.0 article. What were you hoping to do? Were you trying to blog about how you do it, or trying to give people some ideas around how different games and approaches could be successful for them?
This actually started with a long-running petty irritation. And the long-running petty irritation was listening to designers. And I know many, many designers. I've been writing the blog for years and been to lots of events, and I work hard to know these folks. And the petty irritation is this kind of brag. It's like bragging about how I don't prep. I am an improvisational GM. Like, this is a goal to aspire to. That if you're really good, if you're really talented, you don't have to prep. You can just run off the cuff. Which is actually true and necessary for convention play, because you can't really prep for the people or anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it shows in the rules. I can read a section in a rule book when I'm reading something, and I can just tell you like to be an improvisational GM, and therefore you just sort of cheated your way through the prep section of the rules. And it just bothers me because it kind of feeds the larger mythology of designers as special, and it helps build this mythology of GMs as special. And I really don't believe designers or GMs or players have any magical powers that can't be learned. And that just bothered me. But in fairness, a lot of these games are built to support improvisational play, which is why it's so easy to improv these games at cons. You don't have to have a monster manual. You don't have to have a lot of stats lined up. You just let the moves do their thing, and the moves will barf up good drama. All fair. So my follow-up thought to that was that you can absolutely prep for these games, but you're preparing to improvise. Whereas I think kind of my thesis of the piece was that a lot of people think prep exists so you don't have to improvise. You do it to avoid improvisation. I don't want to have to make up monster stats. I don't want to have to make up a series of plot points. I don't want to have to make up where these rooms are. So I'm going to do all this prep. But there's this other way of prep, which is to get your head right to prepare to improvise. And some of that's just ongoing skill, but also some of it is adapting your play, adapting your story situation at your table from week to week to week, above and beyond just dreaming up what would be a hot scene. And so that's where the piece came from, was the irritation that led to the realization that I totally prep, even though I'm also improvising.
Interesting combo. It's one of those things that's always challenged me with games like, for specifically, I think about Cartel, which Cartel has a number of scene opening moves or session opener moves that rest within the different playbooks. And like, wow, do I prep for the 10 plus and the 7 to 9 and the 6, but I don't know what they'll choose. And like, so how do you prepare for something like that? What are some of the things that you do to prepare to improvise?
I broke it down in the article. I think I got kind of 3 broad categories, and I'm going to see if I can remember any of this. But the first one is just to understand the genre you're working in. I don't love that so much story gaming leans so hard on genre tropes and established rules of these stories, but those are the things that make these games easy to improvise, because we can lean on the tropes and the genre rules and stuff like that. So that's a place right there. If you don't know narcofiction, go find some and find out, like, what are the tonal ranges, right? Watch some Breaking Bad. If you've never watched Breaking Bad because you heard it was popular and you hate popular things, set that aside and watch some Breaking Bad, because that's what Mark read. Mark Truman watched Breaking Bad and other narcofiction and produced Cartel. So if you want to get into his head about what he's thinking when you're looking at these opening moves and you have no idea, like, what's suitable, like if you've got a move that says somebody close to you is in trouble, like, how much trouble is acceptable? Is it okay that your wife has gone missing? Is it okay that your kid got kidnapped? Is it okay that your boss got shot? And if you don't know what's cool and what's not cool for the genre, it's going to be hard to fit your off-the-cuff answer, whatever they roll, right? So it's a little bit like I feel like every PBTA has a different kind of tonal range, especially in its miss zone on the MC move side of things.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're talking about around knowing the genre. As I've talked about a few times on the podcast, I run a Star Wars game, and I shift up the different RPG system that I'm using. I try to lean in as many Apocalypse Engines games as I can. I know Star Wars feel like I play with people who can rattle off stuff that I would have to look up in Wikipedia, and they just like know it. I know the feel. And a lot of times when I'm emceeing, I feel more like I'm remixing, like I'm a DJ. That's why I like the term MC in a way, because I know the beats of, okay, in a Star Wars game, this is the kind of possible outcomes. And so I get what you're saying about watch Breaking Bad or understand where the genre inspirations are that lead to this game. And it does create that connective tissue for the MC moves to make sense, to reveal a deal done in someone's absence. It doesn't mean that you have to sit down and prep a bunch of deals, right, and know everything that's going on, because that would be the way that leads to my madness. But to say, hey, this is this person, all right, who's the mirror opposite of the people that are involved in this? They've done a deal with that person, and then back your way into it.
Yeah, I can think of examples emceeing with Monster Hearts in particular, trying to keep the scale of the game to be teenagers in high school, because if you have an MC or players that aren't thinking along the same lines, it could spiral out of control pretty quickly.
Right. So the second big block of stuff in my piece was understanding kind of the mechanical underpinnings of the game, which I think is pretty important. So I have a few kind of guiding principles about how I think about games. One of them is a basic belief that all games come down to completing patterns and intermittent rewards. Which, if you look at Vegas, that's the ultimate conclusion of all gaming everywhere, is it's pattern completion and intermittent rewards.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting 3 cherries in a row, you drew a good hand, whatever, right? But they don't happen all the time. And because they don't happen all the time, your brain craves them, and then we get them. So genre is a pattern, and the inputs from the game are the intermittent rewards. The 10 pluses are intermittent rewards for the players, and the 6 minuses are intermittent rewards for the GM. And so a part of that is understanding the economic cycles of how games work. And that sounds very chilly and very like Econ 101 type stuff. But what I'm talking about is figuring out what the players are going to chase and why, because that is a great way to prep. If you know somebody cares about advancement, then they're going to chase like the basic advancement stuff that's baked into the game. But if you have players that want to chase down opportunities to chew up the scenery, or to have a really big dramatic death, or a big payback scene, or deliver a little whatever, right? If you know that about the players, those are the cycles they're pursuing. Not all economic cycles are about advancement. And I think it's really easy to forget that. And so that, for me, is the next big chunk of prep, is really understanding the cycles, the gears of the game. You know, how scenes start and how scenes spool off into new scenes, and how players will be incentivized by something, and where those incentives will probably lead. And that one's just kind of knowing how the game works. Some people know how the game works, and they can work their way through an elaborate combat system really quickly. That's not really where my strengths lie. My strengths lie more in understanding the underlying wheels within wheels that are constantly turning as the game proceeds.
But I think there's something interesting there that you're also saying. You're not just saying know the mechanics of the game and the genre and those cycles, but also know or get to know the way that the players want to engage with them. You talk about people who want to have those scenery chewing scenes. That may not be rewarded in the game system at all. You've got to make space for it. That's really interesting. And I think that's the kind of next level of GMing that I always want to aspire to, is not just be able to fulfill and facilitate the game, but also know what are the inputs that the players gravitate towards, so you can set that up more. I have a little example. I was running Apocalypse World for a group, the first time they'd ever played, and I thought that I could force a situation by, as the MC, I said, I am going to highlight your hot. And I highlighted all player characters hot for the start of a session. And I would say, because I want to see you guys manipulate and seduce. I want to see you guys engage with that move. I want to see how that affects our fiction. And there was almost no XP that game, because that's not what that play group was really interested in. Now, granted, I could have probably set up different situations to call for it more strongly, but just using the carrot of XP if you hit this move was not good enough.
I've also seen this backfire where players, especially when they highlight each other's stats, someone will tell the other player, oh, you should be doing more of this. And there's a bit of resentment that comes out of that. And then there's no XP that's gained that session.
Yeah. I was such a fan for a while, quite a while, of highlighting stats, because with a group that trusts and knows each other, it's a neat meta-level conversation of like, I want to push you to try this other thing for a little bit. But I'm starting now to understand, that's not always fruitful.
But it's true. I mean, not everyone is incentivized by incentives. The game can give you incentives, but not everyone's going to bite for that. Not everyone wants the wriggling worm on the hook.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really interesting to learn how to take the temperature of the table, even in a one-shot situation. At a convention, you can still kind of suss out kind of what people actually want versus what the game is mechanically offering. And it's a whole other level of just reading human beings that I think is kind of an under-addressed topic in running games.
Yeah.
I'm pretty ruthless with this, and I will sometimes just cut to the chase, especially at a convention game or a one-shot, and ask people at the beginning of the session, what do you want from this? What inspires you to come to this table? What are you looking for? And then acting on those answers.
That's a great question, Rach. What kind of answers have you gotten back that kind of surprised or caught you off guard?
I once had a convention table where it was a bunch of D&D players who had been listening to, isn't it the Adventure Zone that was using Monster of the Week recently when I was running them?
Yeah.
They were coming in with the expectation that it would be a dungeon crawl that was mechanically different, so we leaned hard into it being a dungeon crawl. Even though Monster of the Week isn't quite there to support that, it turned out pretty okay. They had a good time.
Cool. Okay, so last bit about prepping to improvise. In my article, I talk about a thing called a situation map. And a situation map, it's an ongoing campaign play thing, but it's also terrific for one-shots. Basically, I absolutely adore giant sheets of butcher paper. I love them. 4 or 5 feet long, 3 feet wide, dominating the center of the table, and a big pile of Sharpies. And in the course of creating our situation for these games, especially the ones that are where setup is part of the play of the game, setting up your factions and drawing the maps, is drawing out the big relationship map. I feel like a big visual centerpiece is enormously important for live play. And that's something I'm really, really missing trying to figure out online play, is that isn't something that's easy to replicate because it doesn't serve the same purpose. But sitting in around a table, drawing out the relationship map, drawing out connections between characters, but those connections are somewhat static. And I think a lot of your listeners probably will have read the phrase relationship map or already know what that is referring to. The situation map is kind of my turn of phrase, kind of my invention. And it refers to mapping situations in motion on that paper. The situation isn't a static thing. It's something that's definitely going someplace, which brings us full circle back to the clocks question that we're going to get to here in a second. But actually mapping those things visually on the physical map where everyone can see what's coming, what's going, all these impending things happening is what I find is very useful, and that's something you can definitely do between sessions, and that will help you improvise because that'll keep you from forgetting that certain things are in motion, which was the point of clocks in the first place.
Yeah, the situation map is really interesting. I think playing online, I would find it a little challenging. I guess thinking of tools to help replicate something like that, Trello, might be an option. And then just looking at one of the examples that you have linked in your blog, possibly Google Drawings could be a good way to do it. There's no real one tool I can snap off and say it's as good as butcher black paper and how flexible that is and how present it is at a table. So I can see your challenge.
And there's some theatrics to it too.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're busy adding new elements to the map, you don't just quietly add a little square and write something in, you announce it, right? You announce it and you say, here comes the evil enemy core, or here's the giant firestorm that's rolling over the horizon, or whatever. But you say it out loud and you make a big show of drawing it and you get everybody kind of involved, and different conversation because that's really about like the challenges of online play. But the theatrics of the thing I think have been the hard part for me. Is it's hard to do that with Zoom's whiteboard or Jamboard or Google Draw or anything else.
It'd be interesting if you could take a tool set meant to do, again, more of a top-down dungeon crawl and allow it to convert into a shared whiteboard situation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not too familiar with Roll20 and how much flexibility is over there.
I ended up using a drawing tablet and the Zoom whiteboard, and that's pretty close because I can announce loudly over the microphone while their screen is dominated by the whiteboard, oh, here comes the so-and-so. And it sort of works, but after a few seconds, they want to see each other's faces again, which is easier at a table because you look up from the table and see a face.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be kind of conscious to draw the thing and then switch back and get back to faces and get off the whiteboard.
We should just mandate everybody has 2 monitors, really. I think that's a terrible thing that I've thrown out there that I wish somehow I could wave a magic wand and make true, but not really a thing.
Me too. Yeah, I actually have 3 in my office, and most of my players are on laptops. And
exactly.
It's a completely different experience.
Very different user interface, yeah.
I too am on a laptop for online gaming right now, and The only monitor I bought was a Cintiq, and that doesn't quite work for this. You can't really dual monitor that.
Well, you opened the doorway. Or perhaps you wound the clock, Paul. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
Synchronized swatches.
Yeah. No one's had a swatch mechanic in the game yet. Oh,
well,
no.
Was it Parker Lewis Can't Lose? That's where that quote's from? So we need to do Teenage Shenanigans, the role-playing game, and it could be a swatch mechanic.
Swatches. Nice. This is terrible. I hate it. Anyway. All right, let's talk about clocks.
Clocks. So I have to be honest. I don't use clocks for most of the PBTA games that I run. I find it problematic because I don't know when you move a clock forward. Because let's say that you have a clock, right? And are you supposed to have cool ticks on every clock mark? If you don't have cool ticks, then does that mean you move your clock when people look at you expectantly? And if it doesn't have a cool thing on the tick, then how does anything happening? And then you're just playing a little solo game that you don't tell anybody about. Or maybe you only move the ticks when they miss. But if they miss and it's not that super interesting or applicable what's happening right now, then it's like they miss and nothing happens. And you ask them, what do you do? And then what do they do? Because nothing happened to make them do a thing. They already did the thing and it didn't work. That's my experience with clocks.
What happens if your ticks change and your players blow up the things that are on your ticks?
It's already blowed up, so I guess we jump ahead or we jump back. I don't know. Clocks
Can clocks move backwards?
Well, I agree with everything you just said, which is why I proposed a different use of clocks as a concept. And some of this is coming in from the Blades in the Dark universe of games.
Okay.
And Impulse Drive, which I know Rich knows very well, kind of borrows from the same thing, I think. Looking at the way they do, what are they called, fuses?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, it's a clock. I agree that actually having anything specifically, fictionally specific in the clock write-up you do in, say, first edition Apocalypse World is kind of a drag because you might not be able to fit the event into the events of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Then in Blades, they use the phrase clocks, and I have a really, I think, pretty good piece in the blog about this, about Blades clocks as the secret killer app of the Forged in the Dark system. And I really wish he'd called them something different because it's the same word for a very different mechanism. In Blades, clocks don't have fictional anything. They are 4, 6, or 8, or 10 slices. And as the players close in on some large goal, or as some large threat closes in on them, you just kind of tick off the clocks, and they're a visual reference, and they look great. You can see a circle filling in a way that it's hard to really appreciate if you're just like ticking off a list of 1 through 10.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Impulse Drive does a pretty good job with this because Adrian uses Forged in the Dark style clocks in a PBTA kind of way, where he says you don't have to fill in the slices. Leave them empty. I agree with that. And occasionally apply a tick to one of those on a miss or on a hit, rather than plowing it right back into the immediate fiction, which I feel like is a lot like doing an off-screen MC move, which is kind of an announcing future badness, right? Just dress it up a little bit like, oh, meanwhile, the enemy troop carrier has just dropped out of warp space and is approaching your position. This is something that players, the characters can't possibly know, but here's something that's kind of cool to put on camera, and it's easy to say as you're checking off that check. And so, for me, I love using clocks to prepare for improvisation, but I don't ever put a fictionally specific event on that list because that's not improv. That's something else. What I do instead is I list how the situation is changing. So-and-so's hard hold is put to fire by the bad guy gang is very specific, but like, God, what if the hard hold falls before that? Or what if the bad guy gang is defeated? You can't use that anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead, what I've been doing is listing situations like the hard holder's position is dramatically weakened by a rival gang. It's a little vaguer, right? Just kind of pull it back from the right in the weeds view up to the 1,000-foot view. And I think it's hard to think about situations, and I think that's not a skill that's especially well practiced. Because I think it's real easy to think about really hot scenes, like Robin Law's Feng Shui is all about setting up really neat set pieces. And the set pieces are elaborate, very specifically described fights in ninja warehouses or car garages or whatever. And it's full of all these very specific cool details you're going to drop into play, right? But that's a different kind of game, and you don't really improvise. You nudge the players toward their marks so that that set piece can take place. And so if you have to play a game with improvisation, you can't do that. You got to have these situational changes. And then it's a little bit harder because it's a little harder to figure out, like, what does it look like when this hard holder's position is weakened and weakened again and weakened again? And that gets tedious, right? But it does make you think a little bit more about actual important shifts in tempo and context versus the specificity of this place going up in flames, which maybe that's going to be how this hard holder loses their position of power over the valley as somebody sets their thing on fire. That's cool. That might happen. But they might also lose it if their wells get poisoned, if the fuel lines get cut, if the gas trucks get waylaid, if Bullet Town goes up in flames, they can't buy bullets anymore. There's lots of ways to get there, but the context was the important part.
I like how clocks seem to work seamlessly with the situation map. Like you draw the situation map, the clock just says, hey, let me daydream ahead to this situation moving forward in a bad way. Is that how you normally use the two together?
Yes.
Cool.
Sometimes situations are also on the player side. It's a player facing, it's a positive situation. Like they are trying to break the princess out of the interrogation cell. And that can be a situation that proceeds where the first step is they find out where she is. That's not so specific. It's not like they found the bad clock in that case would be that the characters break into the Death Star computer. That's too specific, right? But what if it's broader? What if they just figure out which cell she's in? And when they get there, the escalation can be they defeat her defenses. And the escalation from that can be she's removed from the cell. And then the escalation from that is they find their way off the Death Star. And that's like the final thing, right? Rather than prepping where it's like they got to have this fight and they got to have this chase and they got to have this. And I think it's the specificity that kind of undermines the practicality, the practical use of a clock.
Mm-hmm.
I think the important thing about setting up clocks in advance too is so that you don't go to the easy thing, the thing at your fingertips. Like the easy thing is knowing the genre, right? You know it really well. It's easy to go to. But the harder one is remembering maybe some larger purpose or point you want to get at. You want to hit a certain tone, or you want to make sure some larger picture situation is changing in the foreground that everyone can see it changing. And it's easy to forget that when everything's moving really fast. And in PBTA games in particular, you've got that snowballing. It's exciting. It's exciting to watch every session until the end of the session, and everything's on fire and everyone is screaming and everything is just, it's chaos and it's fun, right? And it's great for a one shot, but maybe that's not the way to go. I know I personally am terrible at de-escalating. The game itself wants you to escalate, and I'm terrible at it unless I've prepared myself to know I need to do it.
Rach, you did a walkthrough of some games you had handy talking about clocks. 'Cause I'm really curious. Clocks is a thing that started in Apocalypse World, and it's been adopted in some other games, but that use Powered by the Apocalypse, but not all of them. Do you want to kind of hop through that?
You put forth, though, the idea that clocks may actually predate Apocalypse World when we were discussing clocks before the podcast. So, Rich, show us your historian work. Where do you posit clocks came from?
Well, okay. So Paul went uber with Poisoned as the proto-Apocalypse World, and that's fascinating. I've never heard anyone assert that, and is probably not wrong, but I think clocks, especially when I look at the early like Monster of the Week specifically, the way that clocks are constructed for Monster of the Week feels like Dogs in the Vineyard. So in Dogs in the Vineyard, you create a town, you go through town creation, and then you come up with a series of things that will happen if the dogs, the watchdogs of the Keeper of Life, if the watchdogs who are the PCs, effectively, Mormon paladins, more or less, they come into town and there's this sin or this thing that's causing the town to have troubles. If they don't do anything, there are a series of like, okay, these are the things that will happen. And to me, that feels like the first clock. And so when I saw that in Monster of the Week, as the approaches to midnight, if the player characters, the hunters, don't get involved, here's what the monster does. It makes sense. But really, that's like the only of the Powered by the Apocalypse games, I think, that does it that way.
I'm not sure of any other games that do feature a countdown clock like that, which when I saw Monster of the Week, when I was a brand new MC for Powered by the Apocalypse, it promptly broke my brain and I couldn't wrap my head around it.
No, I hear you.
What about Dungeon World itself? Doesn't Dungeon World itself have a series of things that will happen that are closing in on some final... I can't remember what the phrase was in Dungeon World. Some kind of a final something or other.
Grimportance. That's it.
Oh, yeah, that thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I believe Grimportance is a series of of ever escalating catastrophes until the portent itself is realized.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Yeah, it's close to the Monster of the Week one as I read it now. What would happen if the danger existed in the world, but the PCs did not?
Well, cool. See, and that's another very, very early Apocalypse Engine game that I think, I don't know, but it feels a little bit like Dogs in the Vineyard to me.
Sure. Urban Shadows has the storms, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe the storms are kind of the same deal, are they not? Where there's like a series of, you're supposed to kind of doodle up a series of events that will bring the setting closer to the storm taking place, whatever the final grand finale of that particular storm is.
I always saw storms as being kind of vague because the storm is the city, but it doesn't really give you something like Grimportance. It talks about different type of threats. Threats have clocks.
And Urban Shadows is one of... I love Urban Shadows.
Looking up Urban Shadows, it does try to give you a structure with threats, which use the countdown clocks. They are graphically the same as they are in Apocalypse World, which is interesting, and I have some feelings on that.
Ooh, share your feelings.
In the back of Apocalypse World, it talks about the design of the clocks aesthetically are supposed to resemble the Doomsday Clock. So the Doomsday Clock is, of course, the countdown to midnight where the world explodes and everyone shoots missiles at each other and we all die. Very Cold War thing. It's probably more topical for Generation X members of the Powered by the Apocalypse community, although I am a millennial and I do remember the Doomsday Clock being a thing. I think in certain ways that graphic design choice has haunted Powered by the Apocalypse because it's always around, even if it's not thematically on point. It makes sense for Apocalypse World, which is post-apocalyptic, but does it make sense for Urban Shadows to have a Doomsday Clock with a countdown to midnight?
Right.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, I like that in Blades. Again, getting back to Blades in the Dark, is they don't bother with that. It's just simple as a pie slice. It's 4 slices or 6 slices, 8 slices, 10 slices, whatever. And it's always even numbers for some game math reasons, but also because it's really easy to draw on an index card and throw down on the table. I feel like it kind of serves a similar purpose to putting an aspect on a table in Fate. The same kind of vibe is you draw the thing, you put it on the table, everyone can see it.
Put on an index card, toss the index card down.
And then you make a mark on it and everyone's like, oh, they can see it, rather than being a GM facing thing where you're just kind of quietly putting a little, check mark on a piece of paper on your pad.
Well, I had put forth thinking about other situations that you could go lean into with the countdown to midnight. One of them being the Homeland Security Advisory System, in that you're never going to reach blue or green. We need more colors. Maybe not, because it becomes an accessibility issue. But always a Doomsday Clock.
I believe Impulse Drive is just a list. I think it's just a list, and it's like any number of things from 3 to 6 or something like that. It's a pretty small range, actually. But I think that's why they call them fuses instead, because it's also like a literal, the graphic design is like just a string of little boxes that you're filling in as you go.
So Monster Hearts, I looked at Monster Hearts too, couldn't find any clocks necessarily in there. They were aesthetically there for the hit points for the player characters in first edition, but I'm not sure about 2.
Okay. What other games did you see any?
Monster of the Week, as we've talked a little bit about Monster of the Week, so let's circle back there. So Monster of the Week has the countdown, which is what happens if the hunters don't get involved. It's various steps between daylight to darkest night. I think they were flipped out of order accidentally. I remember that coming up at Tome of Mysteries, the follow-up book. But it's like dusk, twilight, sunset, and again, supposed to be what happens if the monster isn't interfered with. And of course, there's the sprawl, which is all clocks all the time. Everything is a clock. You have clocks that are your harm. You have clocks that reflect your missions. You have clocks that reflect your reputation and relationship with corporations. And then you have threat clocks, which are closer to the Apocalypse World clocks, which are situations with sustained action or threats with sustained action, I believe is pretty close to the quote with inside the book.
So Rich Howard's original question was, I could really use a primer on how those work from the perspective of different games. Kind of swinging back to that, I don't know, I think my answer would be like different games just kind of ripped off clocks, for one. And if they didn't rip off the clocks, then they have a list. And I think we've kind of talked about that a bit. Or they just don't have clocks at all. Like I just looked up The Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power, which I really like a lot. And it does not have anything like a clock. It just has a kind of a deconstructed relationship map system to it. It mostly cares about interconnections and then just kind of hopes that you can keep them all straight in your head. That's one where I don't think they half-assed it, but I think that they had an idea to kind of keep notes, and then that's kind of all we got out of it rather than a practical tool to actually prep. I'm trying to remember Apillion. Doesn't Apillion have a...
Apillion's got a lot of structure to it. Masks, I think, has plot arcs, which might fulfill some of the ideas of sort of clocks and storms being a larger scale idea.
Yeah.
It's really situational depending on the game. I mean, there is a lot of thought to take away from if a game encourages the use of clocks to go more abstract and let the details and the specific scenes play out depending on what is more important to the story at any given point in time. But it's kind of hard to connect clocks across different games because they're all looking at it very differently. And there's no holy grail, as it were, to go back to the saying, this is what a clock is, and this is only what a clock should be, because everyone's got different interpretations of it.
Right. And different games need to handle different things. I mean, Apocalypse World's all about ratcheting up the tension, the immediacy of your situation, right? Which is why things snowball so aggressively. And so, like, it's kind of great there if what you want is lots of snowballing and lots of, like, urgency from session to session, and then just sort of start again next week with another round of ever-escalating fireballs. But, yeah, different games don't need that, really. Impulse Drive can use it. It's doing pretty good with that. Iron Sworn I haven't read enough of yet. Looks pretty exciting, but boy, it's a lot, isn't it?
I have not yet taken the plunge to read through it. It looks like a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't touched it yet, not gonna lie.
Sagas of the Icelanders broke away, and it's really early, too. So Sagas is one of my... It is my favorite PBTA. I love it so much. And it's totally squirrely, and it's not a great tight design the way we have now, but I adore it. I've played so much of it. And in Sagas, there was not a clock, and that was like maybe the third or fourth PBTA hack out there. Right? Like Monster World, Dungeon World, and then like Sagas, I think was kind of in that early package. In that one, they had a bunch of situations kind of brewing based on which pair of gods you were thematically dipping into, but he didn't really bother with a structured, constant onward pressure.
Paul, do you think the persistence of clocks in PBTA design leans into the idea of, well, Apocalypse World had it, and I should have it because am I truly powered by the apocalypse if I don't have clocks?
So is it like a branding thing?
Maybe.
It's a little branding. It's a little buyer expectation. It's like, what is PBTA? Is it playbooks? Maybe, but Zombie World doesn't have playbooks, and it's perfectly good PBTA. The King is Dead doesn't really have playbooks. Is it moves? It's probably moves. Is it 2d6? Is it the 7 to 9 stuff? Is it clocks? I think my theory is that people feel like there should be some prep advice and don't have a good idea of how they prep themselves. They've spent so long figuring out how the game works, they haven't thought about how to explain how the game works in a longer format to anybody else. And convention play itself, I feel like, really shapes a lot of this as well. Like, why bother including a prep chapter if you're going to play this at a con for 4 hours? I think convention play has really shaped the way a lot of PBTA is coming out these days.
Yeah, I would agree, especially with a lot of the indie games where playtesting is held in convention spaces and marketing your game is the convention is a very important piece of that. I will be very interested to see, with the lack of conventions probably coming up in the next 12 months, what happens as a result. Maybe we get a shift in a completely different way for marketing.
Right. More online play, which would be very interesting. More tools designed, more game rules designed around the online play environment. I'm honestly surprised more games don't come out with character keepers well in advance. I mean, once Rich showed this to me, I'm very new to this stuff, and Rich is very, very old at this stuff. And he put me in the octagon and slapped me around for a while until I figured out how character keepers work. And they're great. It's a great technology. And now I'm wondering, like, maybe these games should be coming out with character keepers in advance of, their final release as a marketing thing, just to help, facilitate these things in online play.
I agree. Well, anything else we wanted to say about clocks? Feels like the clock has run out on it.
I think so.
Yeah, it's very much specific to the game.
And possibly unnecessary. I mean, I would like to come back to the unnecessariness of it. Like Rach has been saying, like, these games included because Apocalypse World included it. And does every game need to have a constant dramatic pressure to force the characters into immediacy and to prompt reactions instead of responses? I've written about that one too. It's fun to react, but like sometimes it's useful to respond, and that's a different kind of headspace you're in. But MC moves kind of demand reaction.
They do. That's why it always followed up with a "what do you do?"
Right.
Well, Paul, I have to say, it's been a pleasure having you on +1 Forward to talk about Prep 2.0, to talk about clocks and the value of clocks and maybe the lack of value of clocks, and a lot of Impulse Drive chat. It's been wonderful. The Indie Game Reading Club is your blog. Anything else you want to plug, Paul?
No, that's it. Come enjoy the blog. Support me on Patreon if you like what you read. I post every week, and my high-level patrons get a preview a month early on what I'm working on.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul and Rach. It was great to chat with you again.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you very much, listeners.
+1 Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for +1 Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, we want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available on DriveThruRPG. Brindlewood Bay is a role-playing game about a group of elderly women, members of the local Murder Mavens Mystery Book Club, who frequently find themselves investigating and solving real-life murder mysteries. They become increasingly aware that there are supernatural forces that connect the cases they are working on, and in particular, a cult dedicated to the dark, monstrous aspect of the goddess Persephone will come to vex them. Brindlewood Bay is a cozy crime drama mashed up with Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your download from DriveThru includes the rulebook for Brindlewood Bay, including a version for easy booklet printing, play aids such as the character sheet and dark conspiracy sheet, and 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake-Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. We'll be releasing 10 more mysteries over the next few months, Some of these mysteries will be featured in the Codex magazine, and others will be part of a standalone mystery collection coming out in late summer 2020. The first of the new mysteries, Exit Stage Death, will be out this month in Codex Yellow 2, available through the Gauntlet Patreon. So be sure to check out Brindlewood Bay on DriveThru RPG. We'll include a link in the show notes. Thanks.